et amor Deus ibi est. Congregavit nos in unum Christi amor, Christi exultemus et in ipso iucunde motiveamus et amemus Deum vivum. Exultemus et in ipso iucunde motiveamus et amemus Deum vivum. Timeamus et amemus Deum vivum. Deum vivum. Et ex corde diligamus nos in cielo. Et ex corde diligamus nos in cielo. Ubi caritas et amor Deus ibi est. Congregavit nos in unum Christi amor, Christi
Good morning. As we begin our service, know this: you are welcome here. Whoever you are, whomever you love, however you vote, whatever your race, age, class, or gender, whether you are here in the church building or using the magic of technology to attend service with us, welcome to this time and place made hallowed by our presence and our commitment. I'm Vanessa Cowie, and I'm the worship team leader at the Unitarian Universalists of Transylvania County, where our mission is to support individual spiritual growth and to promote social, economic, and environmental justice. Whatever spiritual paths you have traveled, if any, you are welcome here, for our faith calls us not to a particular creed, but to a covenant to honor every person's inherent worth and dignity. If you're here for the first time, welcome once again, and thank you for taking the time to find us and worship with us. Our announcements this morning are all about our good health and safety. Please wear masks while in the building. The exception is behind the pulpit. Use the clipboards to sign your name and telephone number just in case contact tracing becomes necessary. The offering baskets won't be passed hand to hand, but the baskets are still there, and bowls at the exits to the sanctuary for your contribution and your name tag. And for the month of July, The special collection is for the Ministerial Discretionary Fund. Enjoy the music without singing for the time being, but feel free to dance and clap and hum as you're willing and able. Exit the building quickly between services to allow for more complete air exchange, and outside we can socialize more freely. Under the rain, perhaps, but still. Our opening hymn today, provided by Janice Cannon, Elaine Shaver, and Carlene Reagan, is For the Beauty of the Earth.
For the beauty of the earth, for the beauty of the sky, for the love which runs over and around us tonight, over and around us tonight, Lord,
We begin today with words from Unitarian Universalist minister and author Gary Kowalski. We gather here to worship, to seek the truth, to grow in love, to join in service, to celebrate life's beauty and find healing for its pain, to honor our kinship with each other and the earth, to create a more compassionate world, beginning with ourselves, to wonder at the mystery that gave us birth, to find courage for the journey's end, and to listen for the wisdom that guides us in the quietness of this moment. We move more deeply into worship with the lighting of our chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism. Our words are, "Blessed is the fire that burns deep in the soul," by Erich A. Heller Wagner. There's always a plan B. Cycle of life ritually holds our joys, sorrows, and concerns in loving community. Edie Gabchik is going to assist me today. If you're watching this live online, please share your joys and concerns in the chat, and I will light a candle for them. For those people who are experiencing loss, fresh loss, or loss long remembered, we light this candle. For those whose loved ones are far away, whether in miles or misunderstandings, we light this candle. For those who experience injustice and those who fight it, often they're the same people, we light this candle. For those who truly listen when others share stories from their hearts, and for those who share the stories, we light this candle. For those who offer hospitality, who open their doors and share their tables, and for those who accept with grace, we light this candle. And for those joys, concerns, acts of courage, and milestones that have been shared this morning as we appear online, we light a final candle. I invite you to pause and reflect on these and all the other joys and sorrows that remain unspoken at this time as we listen to our musical reflection, Days of Beauty.
Oh
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce the Reverend Dick Tucker. I'm very grateful to him for being here as our speaker today. Dick and his wife, Carol Moore, moved to Brevard 10 years ago last month and have been active at UUTC ever since. Carol is a member and Dick is a friend. Dick served as pastor of 4 American Baptist churches, all in the Northeast, and retired for the second time after serving as a hospice chaplain for 14 years. He's a pastoral associate for pastoral care at St. Philip's Episcopal Church here in Brevard and is involved with the church's prison ministry team. Their daughters, Jennifer and Lisa, live in North Carolina, and their granddaughters, Robin and Julia, are students at the University of Costa Rica in their home country. When people ask them why Dick and Carol retired to Brevard, they reply simply, because Brevard. Reverend Tucker.
Thank you, Vanessa. 3 weeks ago, I preached at St. Philip's Church for the first time in a couple of years. And same deal. At that point, we were still using masks, and I had one on. And in the second service, I was a whole paragraph or so into the sermon before I realized I had left my mask on. So I tried to pull it off, and of course, it snagged on the glasses. And I said, well, sometimes it's worse. I had a lavalier mic, so that was over the ear, the glasses, the mask, sometimes a hearing aid, and in the winter, a stocking. It could get pretty, you think you have it bad with masks, but anyway. It's good to be back. The last time I was here in the pulpit was at a kind of emceeing a special service for former Minister Eileen, who was undergoing surgery. And we had a vigil for her, and I was asked to kind of coordinate and set up the pace and all of that. And before that, I've been here about, I think this is like my 8th time to preach, actually, in about as many years. So I feel very much at home. I want to, outside my window, I have my desk and computer right facing a window that faces the street. So as a noticer, which I am, I'm able to watch the traffic and see who's going and which dogs are getting their walk and all of that. And there, a month or so ago, I noticed a big, beautiful spider web, just the full size of the sash, the lower sash. And I watched that, and well, sometime a moth flew into it, and after a number of hours of flopping and so forth, I went out and tried to cut it down, and it plummeted to the ground. I don't know if I saved it life or helped put it out of its misery, but anyway, web. The reading I'm going to use to open is Denise Leverton's reading entitled Web, and it goes like this. Intricate and untraceable, weaving and interweaving dark strand with light, designed beyond all spiderly contrivance to link, not to entrap. Elation, grief, joy, contrition intertwined, shaking, changing, forever transforming. All praise to the great web. Say this along with me if you know it. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I awake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. How many of you were taught that as a child? Most of us. Except that my father, as he knelt beside my bed each night, never told me about the 3rd and 4th lines that brought about dying before I awake. Maybe he thought it was too morbid a thought to lay on a young child, or maybe he just didn't want to consciously acknowledge the fact that that could happen to his son. Whatever, although I could have not have known it at the time, the groundwork was being laid for what became a lifelong spiritual quest. It also established that one should ask that the Lord would keep my soul and take my soul when I died. From childhood on, my prayers were always structured. They evolved sometimes and expanded beyond "now I lay me down to sleep." But it was always the same prayer, blessing the same people, and so forth. As I got older, the prayer was more varied, but always somewhat tenuous, and none of the devotional patterns that I developed lasted very long. I remember going to church camp when I was probably 12 or 14 or something like that, and I had a pretty good working well devotional bedtime prayer setup. And I, of course, intended to carry that on to church camp. But every night, as the lights went out, the camp director went live on the PA system that had speakers mounted throughout the camp on trees, one of these big horn things, and gave a very lovely evening prayer. So much for my carefully laid plans of how to pray at bedtime. It's been said that every person at some level wonders if or senses that there's something more out there, something we can't see, something that we cannot comprehend with our human faculties. And it's been said that in some ways, at some levels, all of us seek to find some kind of connection with that more. It's almost like it's some kind of developmental task, it seems, that we try, or we're somehow programmed to try to connect with, or at least get some understanding of what it's all about. Over the years, I've tried various devotional practices, and eventually most of them have devolved into chores, something that I felt I had to do. A spiritual director I once talked with years ago suggested trying something until it no longer works for me. Problem is, nothing worked for me for very long. A Sunday school teacher, a beloved, loving, faithful woman, suggested to our class, I think I was probably 11 or 12 years old, that wouldn't it be nice if all of us were baptized by the time we graduated into the next level? Around that time, I raised my hand at an altar call at a Billy Graham rally back in Syracuse. Actually, it was a film, I think, but it worked. I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, and that choked up my dad, which made me very uncomfortable for some reason. I was duly baptized, so I knew that my entrance into heaven someday was a sure thing. This was extremely important in the religious climate in which I grew up. My church wasn't all about hellfire and damnation. I recently had the opportunity to review some of the sermons of the then pastor who had been there from 8 years before I was born and till I was in my 30s. And he was way ahead of his time in practical, realistic interpretations of scriptures. He's the one that encouraged me into going into the ministry, and for which I'm very glad. But if you never grew up in the be sure you're saved so you'll be sure to get into heaven religious atmosphere, it may sound strange to you, but this salvation thing was big in many circles, and in so many circles today it still is. Back 30 years ago, when I was a hospice chaplain, a nursing home chaplain rather, one of the nurses had a son in his mid-20s who was a hemophiliac and who had contracted AIDS. That was before they had the opportunity or the technology to screen blood for HIV. And anyway, David caught it and having received some tainted blood. And I visited him frequently, and when he died, I was asked to perform his funeral, to conduct his funeral, which I gladly did. Not long before he died, he, without prompting or questioning from me, he commented that he had accepted Christ. So I shared that at the funeral service, suspecting that it would be comforting to some who were attending. I was not expecting or anticipating the quiet but audible sigh of relief that you could hear around the room. Later on, when I was a hospice chaplain, hospice, my right H is here. I was a hospice chaplain, and this was in eastern North Carolina, in Greenville, North Carolina, I think. Kind of different hospices, but that was the one where this happened. Got a request from one of the nurses to please visit a certain woman who was close to death. I didn't know her. I had not been referred there. She had not asked for a chaplain. So anyway, I went there. She lived alone. Another elderly woman was sitting vigil, keeping vigil beside her in a chair. She was barely conscious, and I sought to learn whether there was anything that might be holding her back, troubling her. And I wasn't sure why the nurse, this came through a voicemail. I didn't know why I should go, but she asked me to go. So I asked some yes and no questions, and she was able to nod appropriately. But I came to the one, do you have any afterlife concerns? And she nodded yes. So I was aware that she had been listed as a Presbyterian, so I asked her, were you baptized and confirmed? Nodded yes. So I assured her that she had done all she needed to do in terms of her salvation entrance. This was no time for theological discussion. This was for pastoral care. And I offered a prayer of confession and affirmed that she was forgiven. And she breathed a barely audible "thank you." And I left. I learned that she died about an hour after I left. These things can hang people up and hold them back. And some would say, good thing it does. That's not where I'm coming from. For 28 years, I served as a pastor of 4 congregations that were affiliated with the American Baptist churches in the USA, and my preaching was more focused on actions than on beliefs, and certainly more than on salvation issues. I never gave altar calls, which occasionally caused some distress in certain circles, and I regularly chose a favorite hymn of mine, which goes, "Christian, rise and act thy creed. Let thy prayer be in thy deed." It was more about what you do than about what you believe. As the years went by, I had increasing trouble buying into the idea that I had been taught and had preached, that in Jesus' death on the cross, he took upon himself my personal sins. And that was what guaranteed entrance into heaven. For one thing, how could the loving, caring, forgiving God that I knew and had worshiped all my life, how could that God, with a stroke of a pen, in a way, consign someone to eternal damnation and torment because they couldn't make sense of the traditional theory of atonement? But could I somehow let go of taking that at face value? Many years ago, I attended a conference sponsored by the American Baptist Churches. I think it was out in Colorado. And in a small group setting, I raised this with a theological consultant. Why, I asked, am I having so much trouble with this no one comes to the Father but by me, claim of Jesus, if that's an accurate transcription? He thought for a moment and said, I don't know you well enough to know if this applies to you, but that sounds to me like arrogance. And I smiled, and the weight of the world was, that I could do something about. If it's an attitude and not an immutable, eternal truth, but could I take it at face value? This was a significant point in my spiritual growth. It was a moment of letting go. It allowed me to give myself permission to look beyond what I'd been taught and to go deeper and look for more life-affirming truths behind some of the simple formulas. I had been taught to be open to deeper thoughts, but that's hard to do. If you know what the truth is, then you have to stick with it. You see, I've never felt the need or had the ability to chuck the whole Christian story. It has maintained a thread through the centuries, which has given life and been a lifeline to countless people, including me. But it became a question of looking for deeper meanings, for more holistic meanings, than getting right with God so as to make it into heaven. Richard Rohr says that the Christian denominations made the gospel into what Brian McLaren describes as an evacuation plan for the next world. Put that way, it does have kind of a sense about it. So what do we do with the message of the crucifixion and the resurrection? I'm not going to solve that for you, but I'll tell you what I'm working on at this point. I'm living into the idea that it reveals the nature of reality. That following the teachings of Jesus, teaching and healing and challenging corrupt authority and revealing the incredible, awesome presence of God and the power of God, doing those things will bring huge doses of wholeness to oneself and to those with whom one comes into contact, and will greatly displease the entrenched powers of empire and may ultimately get you killed. The resurrection, and I do not know and I do not care exactly what happened between Good Friday and Easter, but something sure did. Resurrection is the powerful symbol that the power of life cannot ultimately be snuffed out. That it's worth being faithful to the call of the divine as we hear it, and not to be worried about the outcome. As I said, I'm trying to live into a different interpretation of the atonement, and I've not yet figured it all out. And in some ways, I hope I never do, because if I have it all neatly figured out, I won't have figured out the reality, just a simplified version of my understanding, and that's not enough. I think it's accurate to say that religions of all sorts have arisen and continue to exist to try to make sense of all of this, as if we could. We're a people who want to know. I, at least, am a person who wants to know. Religions try to put into words that which cannot be put into words, and yet we cannot not try. Brian McLaren calls it boxing up the wind in manageable doctrines. Frank, may we have the first slide, please? If you can read that. That's a picture of my coffee mug, and it says, trying to describe the size of the Big Bang. And here are these 3 lab-coated suits in the cosmology department trying to describe. To me, that's what trying to get all the religious stuff figured out means. Of course, as one who likes to have things crystal clear and settled, that's my temperament, that's been measured. My personal experience with my own spirituality has been anything but figured out. But I found that I have neither the need nor the ability to do that, but I have had the need and the ability to let go of those aspects of the Christian faith that no longer work for me. That has not been without some degree of anxiety and not without some considerable grieving the loss of the assurance of what worked for me in the past. But it has enabled me to grow in some very encouraging ways. When I was in college, I attended a conference somewhere, and one of the presenters spoke about God in a way that piqued my curiosity and hope. I sought him out and asked him a question I thought would solve everything. How, I asked him, do you define God? He replied, much to my disappointment and frustration, one cannot define God. One can know God. One might think that attending and graduating from a theological seminary would fix all that, but one would be wrong. My seminary education made a huge contribution to my spiritual growth. I was exposed to thinking that was way beyond my comfort zone. But as I look back, I still was wearing many of the blinders with which I grew up. And so I was not able to really let go and soak up some of what was being offered. However, a seed was planted that would prove to be life-changing, although that seed had to germinate for more than 40 years before it really started to grow. Going back to prayer and my difficulty with it, I'm not sure when or where, but I had come to understand that there were ways to connect with the ultimate that I did not yet know, but which I sensed involved something called a contemplative prayer. The word mysticism had always intrigued me, but it always seemed like it was the province of a unique kind of individual who possessed special spiritual powers, certainly not anybody like me. The late Ronald V. Wells, who was the president of the seminary during my sojourn there in 1964 to 1968, offered an evening seminar entitled Christian Mysticism and the Renewal of the Church. As soon as I saw that this was being offered, I pounced on it and signed up. It was fascinating, and I got many new insights into Christian spirituality. But the one thing that stood out for me was the comment about what he called the prayer of simple regard. To regard something, simple awareness. That's a form of contemplative prayer, which he described as simply being present to God. Years later, a spiritual director that I consulted suggested to me that prayer is being consciously present to the presence of God. In another time and place, I was with another spiritual director describing something that triggered feelings of connection and lump in the throat and meaning and beauty. And she said, "Why don't you just ask God, is this what you are feeling?" I couldn't put that together in a way that I can see a connection now. Those were ideas with which I lived for many years, but it wasn't until we moved to Brevard, and I joined St. Philip's Episcopal Church that I began to pick up momentum. My time with UUTC also contributed to this. But soon after we moved here, Rob Field, who was then the pastor of St. Philip's, offered a community-wide evening session to introduce the practice of centering prayer. I went the very next week to the very next weekly meeting on Wednesday, and I've never left. I found out that centering prayer, which involves sitting quietly for 20 minutes following certain guidelines, sounded amazing like what Dr. Wells had presented that evening seminar during my theological studies. In the book, The Naked Now, Learning to See as the Mystics See, Franciscan friar Richard Rohr is my, like Ernie's Carl Jung. Richard Rohr says this about prayer. I use the word prayer as an umbrella word for any interior journeys or practices that allow us to experience faith, hope, and love within ourselves. It's always a form of simple communing. Despite what Christians have often been taught, prayer is not a technique for getting things, a pious exercise that somehow makes God happy, or a requirement for entry into heaven. It's much more like practicing heaven now by leaping into communion with what is right in front of us, like that. I wish I could tell you that everything has fallen into place and that I now understand and experience that ultimate connection with the intimate connection with the ultimate. But as one who likes everything to be clear and precise and all in good order and clear and unambiguous, hasn't happened yet. Frank, may we have the second slide, please? Okay, maybe the light's out too. In case you can't read it. Linus, that's Linus, right? I'm never sure. He's sitting against a tree and his head droops and he walks away. I'm a lousy meditator. I always fall asleep. And then another one, Lucy, accusingly says, "Where have you been all day?" "I've been meditating." "I don't think it helped you. You don't look any different." "I'm new at it." Okay. Can I identify with that? Oh, yes. But not completely. You see, even while I keep thinking that something ought to happen during the 20-minute sit, I've discovered that something indeed happened in my life. I have changed, and in some very good ways. I can feel it. My wife has noticed it. Colleagues in the centering prayer group used to comment on it. Now it's more, I guess, the norm, I hope. But anyway, I can't even describe what it looks like, but I feel more and more whole, more and more at peace than I did most of the earlier parts of my life. I can see that there is that of God in every other person, and in nature, and in myself. There's been some significant transformation. Contemplative Outreach Limited is an organization, international ecumenical spiritual network that teaches the practice of centering prayer and also Lectio Divina, which is a form of contemplative prayer. And contemplative outreach provides a support system for those on the contemplative path through a wide variety of resources. But recently I wrote to them in frustration over my seeming inability to really get into centering prayer. And Joy Andrews, a staff member, responded to me by email saying, and I love this, "It's so good to hear that you've been continuing your practice for 7 years even though you don't feel centered. It's a pretty humbling practice, isn't it, that we don't actually produce anything and our own efforts have no results. We are simply letting go over and over to God. And that is life-changing. As you have noticed," she says to me, "God works in secret deep within us even when we are not aware of it. With our regular practice of surrender to God over and over, we are cultivating a new way of being. We can start to see our inner reactions to people or circumstances and see our own trains of obsessive thoughts and emotions. But we can also see that these are not the whole story, much as our thoughts are not the whole story in centering prayer. We can be in the world in alignment with a deeper way of being within us, thoughtfully responding to the world rather than knee-jerk reacting." Incidentally, there is some interest at St. Philip's in establishing an additional new centering prayer group. If anybody's interested, intrigued, or wants more, I can put you in touch. When I was invited to preach today, I felt led to simply share some of my own spiritual journey. And little did I know that Ernie was going to do the same thing last week. But I knew mine would be different enough, and I'm comfortable enough in my own journey that I wouldn't worry about that as I might have in the past. I was asked for a sermon title and decided to call it "A Mystic." Who, me? Some would say that a mystic is one who can see things the way God sees them. That is in a holistic and interconnected way, sort of like the hymn, "The Oneness of Everything." All of life, all of truth, and all of nature are interconnected in one web of being, of reality. I shared in a previous sermon here that I had a brief encounter about 10 years ago with the theologian, author, and biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann when he spoke at a Baptist conference, the Alliance of Baptists. I commented to him that as I was then, I was 71 years old and was still trying to figure it all out. He replied, "Well, you don't want to peak too early." Frank, the third slide, please. For those that can't see it, family trip to enlightenment. 4 people sitting in it like in a car, a couple up front and the kids in the back. And the kid in the back says, "Are we there yet?" Anyway, in his book, The Mystic Heart, Wayne Teasdale wrote this. And I shared this with you from this pulpit 4 years ago this month as the closing. This is the closing. "Every one of us is a mystic. We may or may not realize it. We may not even like it. But whether we know it or not, whether we accept it or not, mystical experience is always there, inviting us on a journey of ultimate discovery. We have been given the gift of life in this perplexing world to become ultimately who we are, creatures of boundless love, caring compassion, and wisdom. Existence is a summons to the eternal journey of the sage we all are, if only we could see." So am I a mystic? I think that just like each of you, I have elements of mysticism within me. I think maybe I'm what might be called an entry-level mystic, if such there be. The thing is, maybe, just maybe, you are too. The closing is from Ralph Waldo Emerson, The Oversoul. We've used it here before. We're using it again today because it's just right. Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds. As there is no screen or ceiling between our heads and the infinite heavens, so there is no bar or wall in the soul where we, in effect, cease and God, the cause, begins. I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine. There is deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is accessible to us. Every moment when the individual feels invaded by it is memorable. It comes to the lowly and simple. It comes to whosoever will put off what is foreign and proud. It comes as insight. It comes as serenity and grandeur. The soul's health consists in the fullness of its reception. Forever and ever, the influx of this better and more universal self is new and unsearchable. Within us is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. When it breaks through our intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through our will, it is virtue. When it flows through our affections, it is love. Our closing hymn deliberately is the oneness of everything.
to be reborn in spring, to hear and to feel the pulse of life enters my soul as a song to sing of the oneness of
And my challenge to myself and to all of you is to go forth from this time together with eyes and hearts open to the ultimate reality that invades every moment around us. So be it, and amen.